Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining me today in the Zoom Q&A meeting. We're looking at lesson 8, and today we're going to go through the lesson itself, and we have a couple of questions we're going to answer, and just field some questions from everybody on the call here, if there is any. But without further ado, maybe what we'll do is just take a look at the assignment itself. There we go. All right. So we have this assignment split up into 2 different sections. And the first is the local plant survey, which I think is pretty straightforward. We're just looking at some local plants that are native or naturalized in your area. And I don't really think that is a tough thing to understand, but what we could do, there's a pretty good explanation here. So we want it to be local, and we want to use a botanical name, or also known as scientific name. We want to have 3 different sources of information. And this is really helpful in that we can there's not always one good source, so having multiple sources really helps to expand on the knowledge. Well, it helps to expand your knowledge, but also helps to expand the information that you're putting within the assignment. And then we're looking at this primary source, and we're going to annotate that a little bit. So I think what I'll do, I'll just take a look at the template itself. And again, I think this is pretty straightforward. Of course, all of our instructions are highlighted here. So we want to really tie in this planting, or sorry, I'm on the wrong section here. There we go. All right. Local plant survey. So yes, we're looking at medicinals and other uses, and we can list 5 naturalized plants below. And it is quite amazing when you go through this, the variety of uses that plants have that we may or may not have been aware of. One of those might be Douglas fir, which is a conifer here in the Pacific Northwest. And I didn't realize, years ago, I never realized it had medicinal uses. And as soon as I found that out, we started having Douglas fir tea when we felt a cold coming on. And I don't know if anybody's tried that, but it's if you add a little bit of honey to that, it's quite a powerful concoction. So this should be a pretty straightforward section of the assignment. So again, we're looking at these traditional seasonal foods through the different seasons, and then some of the local nurseries and local farms. So again, if we look at sort of level of importance, this is only worth 4 points. So we're not really asking you to, spend too much time on it. The main event, of course, is the plant system design, but let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. Everything I'm going on here is set to that. So here's an example of one of the student examples that is you can find within that module section. And here this person put down 4 plants. Of course, we want to have 5. And again, some very familiar plants here, yarrow and horsetail and blue elderberry and Oregon grape, and then some of the common uses, and again, some precautions or contradictions. So Naturally, anything that has some medicinal value to it would be valuable to a point, and you wouldn't want to have a dose that is too high. So that's a good thing to note there. And again, seasonal edibles and local nurseries in your area, along with some of the local farms, and then a SWOT analysis here. So that is pretty, I think, pretty straightforward. Does anybody have any questions about the local plant survey before we go on to the plant system design? No? Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. So next, of course, is the plant system design. It's worth quite a bit more. We're looking at 14 points here. And this is actually pretty straightforward, but I just wanted to be clear about a few things. And one is sort of the scope, and it lays it out fairly closely here. So what we want to do is have a small example of a multi-species planting or assembly. So it doesn't have to be your whole garden. It just needs to be a section of it where we're going to get a variety of different layers of planting. So here we're asking for a guild as well. So plants, basically plants that are going to complement each other, or not necessarily complement, but they're going to coexist well together. And honestly, that is probably, in my experience, it's probably 95% of the case. It's pretty rare when you have the other occur. And let's see what an example of that would be. Well, I'm sure a lot of you have heard that black walnut is difficult to grow plants around or beneath, and that Western red cedar would be another example. So it's quite difficult to grow anything under cedars, and same with walnuts. And although you can do it, it's just that those plants have developed compounds within their tissues, and often it's the leaf that contains this, that once the leaf drops and hits the ground, it will actually make it really difficult and inhibit other seeds to germinate or other plants to grow within that. So there are these instances where this happens, but in my experience, for the most part, that isn't the case. Often what will inhibit a planting, the success of a planting, can be mismatching plants. So if you have shade lovers and sun lovers together, or if you have a moisture lover and a xeriscape plant, that's when you start to get into, you're either going to overwater the xeriscape plant or underwater some of the others. So that's something to keep in the back of your mind here. So you want to have a goal. What is the purpose of the planting? And you want to choose at least 2 individual plants that have similar structures. So it could be 2 fruit trees, it could be 2 ornamental trees, it could be a couple of trees that are existing on your property. It could be ones that you propose. And these would be the primary plants that you're going to work around. And that's often the way we put together designs anyhow. So and I'll show you an example of what we do in a little bit here, but basically when we put together planting plans, our process is to look at that larger structure first. So we're looking at that tree canopy, and then we start to work our way down. And getting the foundation in place first is, it's a much easier process than trying to move things after the fact. But again, a tree. In a perfect world, we'll see that canopy layer, however that's made up. That can often be two different layers. That might be a very tall canopy layer and then an understory, and then a shrub layer, a perennial layer. You might have a ground cover layer. You might have a tuber layer. You could have a climbing layer in there as well. So this is where I think permaculture and even ornamental design can really shine and improve the ecological systems, is that with all that varied height, you get varied habitat. And we've seen this dramatically shift. We were on a project quite a long time ago. It was a 100-acre organic farm, and we were designing and installing a couple of acres of landscape. It was not really, it had to blend with the farm, but it was ornamental in nature. And as soon as we had that tree and shrub layer in, the bird activity just shifted completely. And then, of course, as soon as those perennial plants got in, that really creates a lot of cover for ground feeding birds. And once you have birds present, you know that there's also other parts of that soil food web, or they wouldn't be there. Let's see what else we can touch on here. So some of the important things to consider: the Ecological Service, the primary species provides, the function of the other plants, the yields, and that yield might be aesthetic, right? You know, often our designs are a combination, and I don't think there's a right or wrong. It really is based on the client's wishes. In my own landscape, we're removing a lot of the ornamental plantings and replacing them with edibles and things we can get a yield from. But that's just because that's the phase we're in right now, and we have food security concerns, so we want to try and reduce that. Why have you placed each plant in a chosen position? You know, that might be actually quite hard to answer. If I had to give that an answer to every single plant I put on a drawing, that might be tough. But it's worth considering the microclimate or the specific area that you're placing these plants and whether they match up with the needs of the plants. Again, we get into the sun lovers, shade lovers, and trying to keep similar moisture requirements as well matched as you can. And how you ensure adequate space for management. And that is a very interesting topic all on its own. So we, with our planting designs, we tend to, it's interesting. So if we have perennial crops that we want to harvest, let's say, you know, blueberries or strawberries or currants or figs, you know, you obviously have to have some access for those plants. It would be foolish to surround them and make it difficult for you to harvest, right? So you want to provide for that. On the other flip side of the coin, when we have plants that are more aesthetic in nature, or we'll call them, say, medicinal herbs, where we're only going to harvest them perhaps once or twice a year, I want to control the ground. So I'm not into over planting, but I want the plants that go in to occupy that space so that weeds don't have an opportunity For instance, if you planted a whole bunch of shrubs and they were 6 feet apart, and one day those shrubs will touch, maybe they're 6-foot shrubs, but initially they don't, and you have nothing planted underneath, then there's this huge opportunity for unplanned events to happen, right? So plants to come in that you haven't planned on, and that's going to increase your maintenance. So we'll take a look at some examples here in a second. Clumping individuals is a great idea with certain plants. So what would be an example of that? Well, here you go. So it might not look right to have a whole bunch of fig trees together, right? But so I would say an individual fig is more effective than a whole bunch together. If you wanted to have more than one, having those spaced appropriately so there's lots of access and light for them is a great idea. If we looked at asparagus, right? You want to have a bunch of asparagus in your garden, then grouping those so you can still harvest them, because you're harvesting them, in a 6 or 8 week period each year, but then allowing them to grow close to one another after that, that may be really effective in terms of helping to reduce your weeding, having your irrigation needs fairly consistent. And again, for me, it's all about controlling the ground, because if you don't plan on it, something's going to happen, right? And it may not be something that you want. So we want to have curvilinear rows. I would say that's correct, unless we're looking at annual vegetables. And then having straight rows, there's certainly a place for that. And layering plants by height. This is huge. Again, I'll give you a couple of visual examples here. And then a solar bowl, maybe you're trying to capture, maybe you have a microclimate. Everybody has microclimates. We have a one here where we know in the fall we get this lovely hot late day light. So for things like, say like olives that have a very late ripening period, or some of the kiwis, that would be an ideal spot for them. And how do they support one another? And that's almost a silly question, because plants inherently want to be with others, right? They don't like to be off on their own. And then again, we want to be careful. We include both botanical and common names. So we're going to have different elements here. We're going to have existing conditions. So really that's basically your base map, right? What's going on at this moment, then what you're proposing. And then the tricky part is doing a cross section of that planting. And you might find you have to do that by hand. But again, we've gone through that cross-section view, so you're familiar with that. And then we're just doing that on a very small scale in this case. So we're going to have that and a plan view. So the 2D overhead and then the cross-section. And this is a great exercise, and it's probably something you would not do for a client, but it's great for yourself to get a feel of how all of these different elements would go together. And then we have the plant species matrix, which is really a spreadsheet-based page, and how these interrelate, and some of the management questions. So it's a pretty, there's a lot to think about. And I would say, from my experience, just with the planting end of it, it probably took me a decade to learn a certain volume of plant material and how to work well with those. So it takes a long time. So if you find you're struggling a bit, like just don't worry, or try not to worry. It's all part of the learning process. I don't have a picture of it, but my first planting was a complete disaster, and it was awful, but it was great. I learned a lot very quickly. And I put many plants in the ground, and I'm still learning. So it never stops. Does anybody have any questions about the plant system design before I show you a couple of examples as well? We're going to look at a question that's been posted on the Google document here. No? Okay. Let us go. We'll take a look at a couple examples. So the student here has their statement of purpose and their goal. You know, those are really good things to consider, and the strategies and how that's going to happen with the elements. And then you can see over here that this person, this student, has their base plan in its entirety and then a portion thereof. So the base plan has a little polygon around it that's highlighted. So that is their proposed fig guild. And this is that area currently. So this would be really just all about existing conditions, what's going on there. And then the next sheet, we're going to look at the proposed planting. And here, this person's done a nice job. I really like this because all of this has been grayed out so that we can really focus on what is new. Because if we go back, it's grayed there too. If for some reason this was colored, it does become a little bit tricky to try and differentiate between existing and proposed. And there's a little note here because there's a berm, what this person's going to do about that. And some of the plants that are going in there. And then a plant legend. So that's great. We have both common name and botanical name. And for most people, they like to have the common name first because that's more familiar. And with myself, I have a hard time with common names, so I tend to lean the other direction. So it's completely fine, whatever you choose to do. And in this case, they've done a legend, and I'll show you. It's a legend and a bit of call outs. It's a bit of a combination, which is completely fine. So this looks great. It's very clear what's going on here. And then here's the side view, which the student did a very nice job. And you can see what they're talking about with this sloping land. So they're going to bulk that or raise that up a little bit. There's their fig. This looks like they're, not sure what that is. Gooseberry, yeah. So this gives us a very good idea from a side view what this is going to look like. And again, the student put that section line A and B, and there's an A up here. So in a perfect world, there would be a line right under their drawing and have the A and B down here. But that's sort of a moot point. It's not, not something to get too concerned about. The other thing I really like here is that in the legend, they've got basically existing soil grade, and then sort of a proposed what they want to do, building that up. So this is a nice example. And there's some heights here too, but we can get that from the scale. And then this person's gone into their plant species matrix. This is an interesting exercise to go through because again, there's that canopy, subcanopy, and shrub layer. And you can see here, of course, there's this huge canopy above. And the fig is not going to get that high. You know, the figs in this part of the world, you know, maybe 20 feet. Often people are pruning them, so it's easier to pick. And see if there's anything else here to. No, so we get into our SWOT analysis, and then this person had some questions, so that's great. So that is pretty much it for that example. If we go to the template file, again, this is set up well to just drop your information in. And again, you may find that doing the cross section here is just easier to do it by hand. And then of course, this is all pretty straightforward. And yeah, that's about it. I don't believe, if we look at this the example, I don't believe it had this page in it. So that's one thing to keep in mind as we, if you reference any of the student examples, because the template file tends to, it's been refined every time we go through a course. Some things get added, some things get removed, but that is definitely an addition. And that's about it. So one thing I will do here, just give you a peek at a little planting plan we just finished up. And it's just a little urban garden. Let me just zoom in here a bit. So with our plantings, we often separate the woody plants from the herbaceous. So we label that here. So these are trees and shrubs. And this is a little bit of a mixture of items that the client wanted to see in her garden. They've got an outdoor living space and then a bunch of 30-inch annual cropping beds here. So it's a little bit of a mixture, trying to get the most out of their urban location. They're also collecting rainwater off, just as an aside. Oops. There's a covered structure collecting rainwater into some liquid totes there, just so you know what's going on with that. There we go. And then we look at the perennial end and we gray out the tree and shrubs. So that way it's a lot easier for us and our clients to figure out, you know, what that proportion would be. You know, how much shrub and tree elements, which are really the main structure, and then the herbaceous tend to be the underplanting. And we also have some herbaceous in these first two beds. We've got some asparagus and oca. So that is an example of what we've done. We'll just go back to where we were. Okay. And we had an excellent question from Ralph. Get my annotation tool. There we go. So Ralph was asking about patterns. Yeah, it's a great question because this comes up quite often and it can be a little bit confusing to try and decipher what a pattern is. And even in the permaculture designer's manual, it's a pretty big section on patterns and what are they? So let's take a look at an example here. So this website is Permaculture Research Institute in Australia. and they often have some good articles. It's certainly worth taking a look at. And they've done a good article here on patterning. So why they're important. And in a nutshell, let's have an example here. Oh, sorry. My phone always rings during a Q&A. Yeah, so the patterning, what is patterning all about? Patterning can be just about anything. It could be this pattern on a snail. Now, you're not going to design your garden around a snail that you found, but that is a pattern. Let's get another one. Maybe I'll hold up this book. Can't really. The way a forest looks, the top of a forest could be a pattern. The dunes in a desert can be a pattern. Waves in an ocean. The root system in a plant. The, as it says here, the scales of a fish. So why is this important? Well, if you have patterns that are obvious within your landscape, you may want to pick those up and have them integrated within your landscape itself. Now, a really good example of that would be with keyline cultivation patterns, where I know that we haven't touched on keyline much in this course and really can't do everything in the course. There's so much to learn. That is more of a broad acreage approach. And let me show you a great example here from the Agrarian Workplace. There was a post that was done yesterday. Here we go. There we go. So this tree, this is a property in Australia that was designed by Darren Doherty, and the property owner installed and maintained most of it. But the patterns that these trees are laid out in are basically the keyline cultivation pattern, and that is determined through observation of contour map. So it's not something you could actually observe on the ground very easily unless your eye was extremely acute. But Darren Doherty and Georgi Pavlov worked together, and they've done some amazing work. So the keyline patterning is such where you have equal spacing between these rows so that all these rows have some potential use. They may be for grazing, they may be for cropping, they may be for hay. I have no idea in this situation what they're doing. Probably not a lot because these are pretty tight. Often with keyline patterning, if the objective is to have, say, some agroforestry and some grazing in the same area, you know, maybe we would have every other row here eliminated so that there'd be plenty of light and plenty of space in between. These trees can mature and we can still have increased production on the ground. And believe it or not, perhaps not in this case because these are tight, but if you can imagine if every other line was removed and say this was for grazing, that the space between the plantings, there's an increase in production. And you would think that that could be the opposite because of the shade that is potentially cast by the forestry crops, but it is not. And it's a beautiful way of designing properties, I think, especially farm properties where you really benefit from having, tree crops with grazing, with annual production, whatever combination you want to come up with. So that's one. If we were directly overhead here, yeah, you can just see how all of this keyline pattern is based on, it's based on moving water from the micro valleys to the micro ridges. So there's dry, inherently dry and wetter areas on this property, which you could determine with a contour map. And they have tried to balance that out. And I would say they're pretty successful. And the way you can determine that is the even growth. All these trees are pretty even, right? You can see up here, but this might have been another phase. This may have been a later phase, but these are pretty well matched. So that tells you that there's an even distribution of water as well as nutrient on that site. So anyways, I thought that would be pretty cool to show you. And that's a living example, something that was planted, I think it was over a decade ago. Let's see, sorry, I should go back to. So that is one example of a pattern. The contours themselves may be an example. There are certainly cases where I have seen permaculture agricultural settings set their annual beds up on contour. So all of those beds, instead of being 50 foot by 30-inch straight, dead straight beds, are on the elevation or on contour. Now there's some disadvantages of that because the contours, the spacing between them is going to change. And whereas with keyline, you're maintaining the same space between them. It's very interesting to see both. Okay, so let's go back to the question here, which I think I partially answered. So Ralph saying doesn't understand how to fit patterns into the design. Yeah, and the pattern is not a strategy. It would be something that is aesthetically or physically there. And it could be anything. But I hope I've touched on that. So if you are watching this, Ralph, and you need to know some more information, please let me know. We can go into this deeper. Let's see what else is going on here. So purpose to provide an example of urban suburban agriculture. Goal, increase flower crop yield. Pattern. I see. So what is that pattern going to be based on? I'd have to actually see your drawing to help you with that. But maybe we can do that. We have a few minutes here. Go back. Well, thought this might be the easiest way, but maybe not. All right. We will just bear with me, everybody. I'm just going to back up here. All right. Well, we have Ralph's paper here. Right. Let's see the base map. So not a lot of space. Now here, if there was more land available, you can see an interesting pattern developing here with these contours. And that is something that may prompt a creative thought, either with some rainwater harvesting structure or planting. So that's one thing that's obvious that jumps out. Let me just see, go to water flows here. Nothing jumps out at me with that. There's also a pattern of some trees here. So that is something else that we could consider. Let's go back to some site photos. That would be at the beginning. You know, in some ways, when we're looking at hard surfaces, they often get patterned off of the structure. And that's been done here. There is some canopy trees from the neighbors right here. That could be some inspiration, especially given that there is some sunshade being used. This is in California. So to create shade, maybe the pattern of continuing these canopy trees, if there was space. That is a big if on this particular setting. Let us just go back to that question. So I hope that helps out, Ralph. I would almost say if there is a question here, you know, not to worry about it. Think, you know, do your best to see if there's any patterns within your landscape that you can utilize with your design. And if there isn't anything obvious, you know, that may take a little bit of trial and error over time to sort that out, to see that. Because I can honestly say that that's, with urban lots, it's harder for that to happen. On larger properties, it's definitely easier, probably because you have more elements there that create patterns within that landscape already. So the same thing with the adding native plants, nitrogen fixers, improve soil, the pattern. You know, in this case, you may or may not feel that the area you want to plant is somewhat degraded, that has very little soil life. And that is something that you could, you know, that could be a visual pattern of just observing degradation, right? And that in strategy would then be to increase fertility, and that would tie in with that goal there. So hopefully that helps, Ralph. It is a tricky question, and I'll even say that in the Permaculture Designer's Manual, Bill Mollison starts by saying that, he's treading into really a tricky area to explain and for people to grasp. And I think that it's something that would become more and more obvious with practice and over time. And it might be quite difficult to see it with your first go around with the design, because really this is learning. We're all about learning the design protocol, how to implement it, and then it's redoing that sequence over time and finding out what works for you, the best approach for yourself, which in turn takes a long time. We do quite a few designs every year, and everyone is completely different. And everybody's needs are different. So it's great that way. Nothing is ever the same. Yeah, so that's about all I have to say on that question. Is there anything that anybody wants to chat about today regarding?
I have 2 questions, Jamie.
Sure.
So one of them is, I went to a very nice nursery, a local nursery, and they told me, a guy with lots of experience, this is in Santa Fe, New Mexico, a guy with lots of experience in gardening in the area told me that nitrogen fixers for the native plants here are not beneficial, that if you put nitrogen to those plants, they are not going to like it because they are used to this soil.
Sure.
This is one of the questions. I would like to know your opinion about that. And the other question is there a book or a website where I can look at pictures and learn more about the design and what plants to put where and things like that?
Yeah, well, your first question, that's a really good one. And that makes total sense where you live, right? So you're in New Mexico in a hot, dry climate. And if you think about it, if you think about nitrogen fixers and what they're all about, they're trying to add that important element into the soil. And what happens to a plant when they have more available nitrogen? They tend to put on more foliage. So that is completely counter to what you'd want to be doing in a dry climate, because more lush foliage is going to mean more evapotranspiration, right? You're going to have to irrigate more in order to maintain that plant. So what that person was saying in a drylands environment makes complete sense. Yeah, it does. And to be honest, when we're putting together planting plans, I don't really think about nitrogen fixers. I just don't, because I'm trying to look at improvement of soil health. And I know that if I get the soil food web working, that the nutrients are going to be there. I don't have to purposely add it. Now, saying that, there are situations where that might be a really good thing, not in a dry land environment, but more temperate. If we were doing, let's say we're doing a hedgerow and at the edge of a agricultural system, like at a boundary of a farm, and you're disturbing an area to plant trees and shrubs and herbaceous plants. And if you integrate nitrogen fixers in there that are going to be short term, maybe you're going to remove them, they can certainly help those woody plants move along a little bit. Now, a good example of that is red alder, which grows in the Pacific Northwest here. So when you have a damaged area, it's one of the first trees that'll be up. It's a pioneer tree. and it's trying to build soil. So it has a short lifespan. It has nitrogen fixing nodules on the roots. So it's putting on lots of growth and then basically dying quite young relative to trees, and all of that biomass is being used to build soil so that eventually the Douglas fir or these other conifers can occupy that space easier. So that's an example where we will potentially use that. And this is going to be very individual for, depending on the location and the designer. And I'm sure like all the instructors here are going to have a slightly different approach to what they do. So yeah, I wouldn't get too worried. I think that's really good advice. So good for you for, having a good dialogue with that nursery person. And obviously they have a lot of experience, and a nitrogen fixture, maybe not a great idea. But increasing your soil health is something that would be definitely giving you some return on your investment in terms of biomass, organic matter. That book that I had mentioned to you, I think way back in lesson 5 from Brad Lancaster.
Yes.
He gets into doing these mulch pits. So he's in a dry land, of course. He gets into doing mulch pits at roadside plantings so that there's all of this biomass and woody material that's below or next to the root systems of the plants he's put in there. And when it gets an infusion of water, it's, moving along in the decomposition cycle. When it's dry, it's not going to do much, but it's like a sponge that's going to help build soil and help that tree along. So in terms of books, there are, I have 2 huge bookcases full of stuff, full of books. They're all horticultural. That for decades, that was my inspiration, seeing what other people are doing and looking at combinations of, because when I do plantings, foliage is the main event that I dial into. I want that plant to look fantastic when it's not flowering, right? There's very few plants we use that are just flat for their aesthetic beauty, the flower beauty. I want to have bold and fine foliage in some combination. And that you can certainly do when you combine that into, whether that's a purely aesthetic garden or it's an edible. Like, and a good example would be artichoke. Fantastic, bold gray foliage. Just, it's unbelievable. We have many in our garden, and we work hard to get them through the winter. They need a little bit of care here to keep the frost from freezing them solid, but that's our approach. Books on dry land plantings. That is a really good question. I might have to get back to you on that.
Sure.
Let me, because we do have an instructor, Neil Bertrado. He is in Nevada, and that's what he's all about, is dry land. I'll ask him. He's not doing the PDC Pro, he's doing the regular PDC. But he might have some good suggestions, because you'd really want it specific. It wouldn't make much sense for you to look at some English garden and think, wow, I want to do that here. Well, you're going to be
buffeting.
Yeah, you'll be frustrated because it's just not going to happen.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so I hope that helps.
It did. Thank you.
Okay. And let's see here. We've got a few minutes left. Is anybody? Carly, go ahead.
Good morning, Jamie. My question is actually relating to the pruning of fruit trees versus like what their mature size is going to be.
Mhm,
I know we have a Rainier cherry out in our front yard that is probably 50 feet tall and
mhm,
has a 30-foot spread on it. Beautiful, huge tree.
yeah,
And in I think it was the permaculture link that was right next to one of our slides. Um, the only thing I could find in that plant search guide was like a sweet cherry,
mhm,
excuse me, and it was saying that has like, an 80-foot mature height. Well, my question is if you are out there pruning on a regular basis, it's not going to reach 80 feet. I mean, if you let it go wild, of course, I've got a huge one out in my front yard.
yeah.
So if pruning is part of what you are considering to be your monthly or your yearly maintenance in an orchard area, how do we kind of fit those things together? Because obviously I would
Mhm,
like to put some cherry trees out there, but I don't want to put in saying, oh yeah, well, I'm going to have an 80-foot tall tree that's going to shade everything else out.
right.
What do I do?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Um, I would say the primary thing that you'd want to look at is rootstock. What
Okay.
is that? So an example would be like the first thing we did when we moved to our property 25 years ago was buy a bunch of apples and plums and planted trees. And
Yeah.
I think we have about 13 fruit trees out here. And they, at that time, I bought it from a heritage nursery here, and they're heritage varieties. So I was very happy with that. But the deciding factor is the rootstock. So, what is the ultimate height that you want to see your trees attain? So, I had this great idea that because I was planting them in a certain area I was planting them in, I had lots of height. There was no issues, so I went with a standard rootstock on my apples. Well, that means they're ultimately going to be 30 feet high, 20 feet high. They're all a little bit different, but I have a beautiful Gravenstein. It just wants to be a monster. It, and I honestly do not get to it every year.
Okay.
You'd think, oh, in January, perfect time to prune. You got lots of time. No, we're usually in the middle of a project. We have a projects in the winter, and then at this time of year, bang, you're on your food growing, and I don't have any
Mhm.
time. So I would have been much wiser if I could turn the clock back. I would have purchased all those trees on semi-dwarf rootstock, which means today they'd be, 12 to 16 feet high. They'd be
Okay.
pretty easy to harvest. I probably wouldn't even have to prune them, you know, or
So we'll
rarely
choose.
have to prune them. Um,
Okay, so semi-dwarf rootstock
well,
will
that's
determine the ultimate height of your trees
the actual
or
rootstock.
the,
So if you were
okay.
to, here, I'll just bring something up online here that's a little more visual, and we'll just use Apple. I'll just share screen here. Yeah, and maybe we'll get lucky with this. There we go. So here, that's a pretty good example. So we have very dwarf all the way up to vigorous. And these are terms that may not be consistent, but you get the idea. And the trick is with this, they're telling you the name of the rootstock. So here it's
Okay.
an M27, an M9, an M26, an M106, or with these other types of fruit trees, St. Julian, a quince rootstock. And so as you can see, if you wanted your trees to be just over head height, you'd want a dwarf stock, right? And then, so you'd want to look for dwarf rootstocks that worked in your area. Here's another example here. Semi-dwarf. Often vigorous is called standard. I think
Okay.
I have M25 on a few of mine. But M26 would have been perfect. Now, the downside of this is if you have let's say you love an apple that, just as an example, an apple that is known to be a little bit tricky, let's say with pests and diseases. It's not, if you have it on a standard stock, it's going to be way healthier, more vigorous than it would be on a dwarf stock. So some of the ailments that a certain variety might have a predisposition to, they may crop up more with this dwarfing, because really the rootstock it's almost like a choke, right? So that's
Okay.
choking the amount of fertility it's sending up the stem. So it's
Okay.
very interesting, but it is an important consideration when you get fruit trees, and it's something I didn't fully consider. I didn't think 2 decades ahead and what's it going to look like. And now I have, I basically quadrupled my pruning maintenance. So because of that, I'll have times I'll go through a couple of years, I won't even get to it. And that's what's happened this year. I've not got to any of my apples, but I'm still able to harvest them, but it's harder.
Oh yeah, I've got a transparent that it's probably been 2 years since I've had a chance to prune it. And yeah, I send my 11-year-old up in the tree. He can collect the apples from the top.
Yeah, and you can get
Um,
some really clever harvesting nets. They're like a little net
yeah.
on so there's ways around it.
Another thing I just wanted to bring up real quick is that I am planning on doing swales in this particular design.
Mhm.
And just for anybody else who's on a large piece of property that is interested, there's an amazing YouTube video from the Weedy Gardener, and he actually cuts in with like a 20-minute kind of excerpt from Jeff Lawton's swales,
Oh yeah.
like how and why and everything about them. Um, that was an absolutely amazing video where Jeff Lawton like broke absolutely every aspect of swales down. So super excited about watching that video. It was really cool.
Yeah, no, Jeff Lawton's all about swales. There's no doubt about that. And I took my PDC through him, and I was really excited to implement them afterwards. And now, this many years later, I rarely would implement them. And when I do,
Really?
yeah, well, it depends on the scale. So I've seen them done on agricultural scale, and they're very permanent, right? So they're a permanent structure in the landscape that can I guess one way of looking at it is you can, if the whole purpose is water distribution, there are other ways of doing it. On a smaller scale, I think they're pretty much risk-free. I mean, I have one on my property. It's from an overflow of our rainwater collection system, and it works great. When I've done them for clients, I've ended up that drawing I showed you, the planting plan, that had one in it, and you probably wouldn't have seen it because it's in the pathway and it's wood chip filled, and it'll have perforated PVC pipe in the middle of it at the bottom of the, so it's basically a ditch with piping and wood chips on top. So it's doing the same thing. It's trying to slow water down and hold it, and then the bonus of having interaction with wood chips. But on a large parcel, I would be very cautious about doing huge swales, because the cost is enormous. The machine cost, right? You're 100, well, here, just for a small machine, it's over 100, it's about $110 an hour right now. It's very permanent, right? So once you build it, if it functions the way you want to, that's great. And it may not function the way you want to, and then that can be an issue. Sometimes you can get some, because it's uncompacted, right? So the swale is an excavated area, but the fill, it's uncompacted, and it's being planted often. And that, if you have the water level come up to that uncompacted layer, there's an opportunity for the water to blow it out, to push it out. Like there's a few things that I'd be a little bit concerned with. But I don't want to rain on your parade, because I know swales are very exciting. So
if I was to do something like underlaying hugelkultur elements in at the base of it to help with that support,
that'd be awesome. Yeah.
With that, and then I know one of the things I was thinking of is that area it's 90% sand. So it'd probably be a year or two before we actually do major planting, like putting tree elements in. So I was thinking mainly just some lower shrubs, vegetation, ground cover over the next season or two to really start building up that soil. And then put the trees in once there's soil that's able to support those trees. Is that maybe a better phase to go through versus just build the swale, shove the trees in?
Yeah, I would say that's your that's a little bit of a risk doing that, you know, just because anytime you disturb soil, it's going to take it away. It's going to reduce the succession. So all of a sudden, it's not appropriate for trees. So you're going to have to work twice as hard to keep the trees happy. You know, if combining hugelkultur with swales is something, another instructor here, Javin Bernakovich, he does, he loves that. And I've seen some of his work, and that's really effective. But you end up with a different structure. It's a hugel mound versus that berm. Do you know what I mean? So you still have a planting area, but it's been in his situation, because he's in more of a cold climate, he is infiltrating over the winter as much as he can, and then he freezes up. But when he gets into that growing season, that wet woody material is just acting as a sponge and helping to move his plants along as we get into drier, hotter conditions. And where he lives, he got 50 degrees Celsius last year. So those sorts of strategies are really helpful. And I believe, I can't remember what crops he was growing on his mounds, but I know when we've done some hugel mounds here that were very similar to what you've described. So they were sort of an on-contour hugel mound, and great success. Things like, you know, we were growing annual vegetables on them. So like squash, like winter squash in particular, seems to like early succession environments, and it of course loves more heat and having an elevated mound to plant on gives you earlier activity. So at this time of year, it's going to heat up quicker. Now the downside is in the heat of the summer, that's a hotter, drier location. So let's say you had a swale and a mound system and you put trees on the mound. Those are going to be dry during the heat of the summer. So that's something to consider, at least in their early years. Now, if you look at Jeff's videos, he'll talk about the water lens under that's created over time over the underside of the mound. Here
I think you said 7 years for full saturation.
And I would say that's, completely dependent on soil types and where you are. Let's see if I can. There are certainly people that do a lot of swale work. Here, I got a couple pictures here. So, that's an example, right? Now, that maybe not the best example, but you can see what now you're dealing with at the top. And you can see there's trees there, right? I don't think, like, I wouldn't feel warm and fuzzy about the success here in the short term. So often what I know Jeff had advocated is after a swale has been excavated and you have that mound, is to just get cover crop on it and some straw and protect it and build that soil succession. There's another example of one that was just dug. And let's see here. There's so many versions. Really, this is a swale / rain garden. And the base of the swale, like in this situation, the base of this is rock. It would be a weeding nightmare. Some people do that. And there's no mound in this situation. There's a mound here, and this is all vegetated, so that would be a lot easier to maintain. But what's the purpose? Right? Like, I'm not sure in this case whether they're just trying to help infiltrate water for these trees that are beside it. That could well be. They are exciting, but I would say that it's really think about what you're trying to do with it.
Yeah, I think at this point, because my soil is so sandy, I really need to slow that water down and create some nutrient holding capacity. So I was thinking is doing the swale in there, putting some hugelkultur on, on the stuff we excavate out, and then actually probably putting in a decent layer of mulch and wood chips down in there to really help that water from just penetrating straight down through all the soil layers. So I know I need something to slow that water down.
Sure. And
because it's also on a really steep slope.
And this is 5-6 acres, isn't it?
Yeah, I've got a 5 acre that I'm working with.
So so the first thing that would come into my mind, if you have that size property, that's a good amount of space. So that would require a lot of excavation work to be effective over that space. But one thing that you could consider is, taking a multi-prong approach where you are trying to increase your water holding capacity within the soil. And that may be a combination of, a key line work, right? So key line not only is redirecting the water, but it's going to decompact lower down. And it seems to me
Okay.
that your areas had horses on it, and it's probably
Mhm.
been overgrazed. So you're going to
Mhm.
have, if you took a penetrometer, which you may or may not be able to access, penetrometer is a device you push into the soil, and it'll show you where those compacted layers are within your soil profile. And if you push it down and you're like 14 or 16 inches and it's below 150 PSI, you're all good. Excellent. But you probably would push it in. And I've been on sites where I've only got a 1/4 inch into the soil and it stops. I can't get any further. And that's when we look at it doesn't matter what we do. If we don't fix that, it will take thousands of years for nature to fix it itself. So that's where we're trying to implement some of these strategies to decompact, to slow the water, as you've mentioned, but that in combination with trying to build the water holding capacity through organic matter, that may be a cover crop. Or no, sorry, that may be just rotational grazing, being very, very mindful of that. So animals impact an area, you move them, they don't go back until that area is fully recovered. And that's all part of, in the bigger picture, that's like holistic grazing, holistic management. And I'm certainly no expert in that, but I know the principles of it. And animals are going to do a better job than a swale will, in my opinion. I know it's in some ways more work. Perhaps a swale and a hugel is part of that. Like when you said a hugel swale, and I've been talking about ones I've seen, it's actually an excavated area. Wood is placed into the trench and then backfilled on top. So you end up with a mound, but there's a swale beneath. It's not beside, right? And that can work really well, but that would be a daunting task on acreage. So I would seriously, pretty confidently say that you'd have a greater impact trying to look at the soil, both from organic matter content and a compaction content. You could perhaps look for a penetrometer. Maybe people rent them in your area. I don't know. You can buy them. They're about $500-600 to purchase, and but they're brilliant, and they're very, very low tech, easy to use. You could probably build your own as well. And if you couldn't find one, even just getting a rod with a handle on the top and trying to push it into the ground, this is the same premise. It's just not going to give you a completely accurate, the feedback will be a little less accurate. So the penetrometer has a gauge on it. And in bigger agricultural settings, they'll get into digital penetrometers and all sorts of crazy things. But there's the very simple ones that are manual, just tell a lot. We take that to every job we do, because I pretty much, you know that there's compaction lurking, and you want to know where that is and how you can best deal with it to increase, because once that happens, once you have, for instance, Mark Shepard, I'm sure you're aware of that. Have you heard of that name, Mark Shepard? He wrote, what is his books? It's a regenerative ag book. Can't remember the name. It could be just regenerative agriculture. He took a farm, it's called New Forest Farm, and it was a burned out cornfield, compacted, basically dead. And he took that and turned it into a like a polycultured keyline system. So he had tree systems, and he laid them out on keyline patterns, and between the trees he would grow annual crops, or he would graze his animals, and he turned that around completely. Not a swale in sight there, right? Yeah, and I don't want to rain on the swale parade. There's also a super interesting video. I'll see if I can find it, and I'll put it in the chat here. It's a discussion on swale versus keyline that David Holgram and Darren Doherty and a few others were talking about. I may have to, I saw it years ago.
Is it on YouTube?
It is. It's probably under the Agrarians YouTube channel. It's fantastic. So David Holgram, who of course is the originator of permaculture, was talking about the difference between them. And, you know, after you watch that and you consider the positives and negatives, yeah, they're tricky to place in a broad landscape. I think they're very, you know, it's much safer in a small urban area, and especially when you can place a pathway on top of it. I'm just sorry, I'm trying to find, here it is. Okay, I'll put it in the chat. All right. There you go. You can take a look at that. And it's you know, not the end all be all, right? Nobody is, but you've got David Holgram, Dan Palmer, and Darren Doherty. So there's, you know, quite a bit of wisdom accumulated between all of those people, and they talk about swales, and so I would have a peek at that. I would always use them. I would still consider them for urban landscapes. I think they're really an interesting feature that can be part of a water system, but on an agricultural setting, I'd be, or acreage, right? Even homestead, I would be, you know, there's probably better ways to achieve the goal, whatever that goal is.
Okay.
Yeah. So I hope I didn't rain on your parade. But
I think I have the majority of the design done. There's definitely some tweaking and stuff that I need to do for this assignment. The swales are going to stay. I've already done too much work in the design process so far.
Yeah.
But maybe in the final design, I'll go ahead and take those out. But for the one that I'm going to be submitting,
yeah,
I can't take them out.
No, I get it. I totally get it. And when we do design work too, we often, well, if it's homestead scale, we'll start with that water layer. So if we had started with swales and then we're moving on to other elements, and then you want to make a change, well, of course, it completely changes everything. So yeah, I get it. But just for future, right? Or if say your friends or clients said, hey, we're going to do this, you might go, well, maybe let's consider whether that's really a good idea or not. It's a great exercise to go through with the design, right? And it may turn out to be fantastic. It also may turn out that the swales are completely empty and never have any water go in them. That's the other thing is, where's the supply? So that's, you know, I should, you know, I could show you my PDC design, and it has swales in it. Oh yeah, it's all of, I thought this would be excellent, but fortunately it didn't get built. It probably would have been okay, but I would, and it was a farm setting, about 25 acres, so with lots of water on it, and there's better, you know, there's some other ways that we can deal with the water. So yeah, but we have gone over a little bit, although get me talking about water, I'll be here all day. But I should go as long as there's no other questions. Anybody have anything they want to add, or no, we're all good? Okay. Well, thank you both very much for attending today, and hope you got some value out of it. And we will look forward to seeing your assignments next week.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you, Jamie.
Okay. Well, you take care.
You too.
Bye-bye.